Into the session number 2, which is called the European Contribution to the Improvement of the Political and Humanitarian Situation in Syria. And without being too long at the introduction, it's, I think, quite simple and sad at the same time. The fighting is going on in Syria. Since 7 years, we are witnessing its devastating effects and also a big humanitarian crisis, probably the biggest one or worst one since the Second World War, also we can say in our neighborhood. Besides saying clearly that we need to support the work of the UN Special Envoy and the intra-Syrian talks which are taking place in Syria, especially these days, the newspapers and the news are also full of the situation, the next humanitarian crisis which seems to come up or tries to be prevented, which is concerning Idlib and this kind of region. We have a high-ranked podium, and without losing too much time, I will immediately ask Helga SCHMID, which is the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, to take the floor and give us her impressions and remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Chairman. And I could not agree more with you. The war in Syria is a tragedy that has been going on for 7 years. And let me be very clear from the outset. I know that you are frustrated, we are all frustrated, and I fully appreciate this frustration about this appalling situation. Let me also be very clear that as the European Union, we have been engaged right from the beginning to push for the only solution, and the only solution to a sustainable peace is a political one. And I'm saying this because I know that for years the focus has been too much on the military fighting. I think the analysis is clear. There are basically 3 factors that made the Syrian uprising what started with a legitimate protest of the Syrian people. But there are 3 factors that made the Syrian uprising end up the way it has ended up. The extent to which it was militarized, the extent to which it was sectarianized, but also the extent to which it became a proxy war. And that's why the political process and the path towards reconciliation and peace has been so difficult. Still, the only way forward to achieving a sustainable peace and a united, free, inclusive, democratic Syria that belongs to all Syrians is the political one. As said, we have been engaged right from the beginning. Federica Mogherini participated herself in the International Syria Support Group, which had been organized by the previous US administration. We've been trying to build bridges between the various parties. We met with only very little flexibility, particularly from those who defended the Syrian regime. But it's exactly the reason what I was saying. It was what we could see was a scramble by mostly regional players to strengthen their positions. And this is why, as the European Union, we came up in 2017 with the EU strategy for Syria, which followed several core issues, core strands of works that are ongoing. The first one is the support we have always provided to the UN efforts, Staffan de Mistura, and the political process in Geneva. And I say a little bit more about that in a moment because there may be some movement there now. The other issue was to assist the Syrian opposition in their participation to Geneva, and I'm very pleased that Mr. Kawakibi is with us. We have been working very closely with him and his colleagues. The other strand of work is the consistent support to the civil society, and particularly to the women's networks. They are very impressive women's networks, both inside and outside Syria. Another point is the accountability and transitional justice as preconditions for national reconciliation. And I have been in many, many conferences, and there are very few actually who make the point about the need of no impunity accountability. This is absolutely crucial. Then, of course, the humanitarian assistance. We have been at the forefront, the #1 providers of humanitarian support, and my colleague from the Commission will say more about that in a moment. And the last point is the support we have given, particularly to with a focus on the opposition-held areas to strengthen resilience of the Syrian people. We have been spearheading the international response to alleviate the suffering. The key issue has always been to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. It's almost 1 billion now for of total aid the EU and member states were providing for humanitarian, but also stabilization and development assistance inside Syria. But also, and that's very important, we have provided support, particularly also to the neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, also Turkey, because they are doing a tremendous job in hosting large numbers of Syrian refugees. We have had 2 conferences in Brussels and announced the 3rd one for early next year. And again, the focus there has always been to mobilize the humanitarian support, but also to keep the focus on the political process. Now, if I may just let me go back to the support we have been providing for the UN-led Geneva process, which has continued throughout the negotiations. The Geneva process has been stalled for too long. And as I said before, the focus has been on the military fighting, and not everyone had come to the conclusion that the only way forward is a political one. This is why the Constitutional Committee now that Staffan de Mistura is trying to set up in Geneva can be an entry point for discussing core issues of the Syrian state and society, which is the type of governance, which is the topic of decentralization, the need for security sector reform, the very crucial role of civil society. As European Union, we had actually organized 2 years ago individual, I would almost call them hearings, brainstormings, particularly with regional actors, to get a better understanding of what their views were, always with the intention to support Staffan de Mistura and his work. There has been progress. There are the famous 3 lists. This was the outcome of Sochi: 1 list for the opposition, 1 list for the government. There was a lot of discussions about the 3rd list. The 3rd list was supposed to be independence, and we have been very much pushing also those who have a leverage with the Syrian regime, particularly Iran and Russia, to make sure that the 3rd list really becomes an independent list. If there is agreement, and once there is agreement, Staffan de Mistura has been very clear that he could actually convene the Constitutional Committee within a week. And that's so important because that would then be go into the direction of a political process that is so needed. Now, the question is, of course, what is the leverage we have as European Union? And as we are not a military actor, one of the key leverage we have, and where we have been very clear and consistent, is the support to reconstruction. But we have been also very clear that we would only support reconstruction once an inclusive political transition is firmly underway. And this, of course, also ties into the issue of returns. There has been a lot about talk about refugees going back. But it's also clear that this is really for the UNHCR to decide. They have the mandate to work on this topic, and they have been very clear, also in New York 2 weeks ago, that the conditions are not yet in place for refugees to return, because and it's also clear that no one will return unless there is a clear political vision on where Syria is going, respect for human rights, but also the respect for physical protection, and an idea about the future of their children. We are not supporting returns under the current circumstances of insecurity, but we will use all our efforts to continue to work towards the improvement of the protection and also the status of refugees in the host countries. Let me maybe point out to another issue that has been very much in the papers, and that's the situation in Idlib. You know, Idlib is the last remaining de-escalation zone in Syria that the Astana guarantors committed to safeguard 3 million civilians in the region, and a military offensive could have led to a major bloodshed. This is why we have been very much engaging with the Astana guarantors. We welcome the Russian-Turkish agreement. I would particularly also welcome the support Turkey has given to that to avoid what could have been a major bloodshed. It needs to be implemented now. Turkey has announced that the creation of a demilitarized zone has started and that some of the military groups present in Idlib start leaving. We have used the leverage we have, also particularly also with Iran. Federica Mogherini has had talks with the Russian foreign minister in Ankara, precisely with that objective. Now, allow me maybe to say, apart from the humanitarian, which I leave to my colleague, a couple of more words about the very concrete actions in support of peace in Syria we have undertaken. One of them is we have established a specific mechanism for funding political projects, the Syria Peace Process Support Initiative. This has allowed us to provide support for the opposition. This is capacity building. This is also the establishment of the Syrian Opposition Office in Geneva. But it's also the empowerment of third actors, as said in the beginning, particularly civil society and women, in support of the efforts of Staffan de Mistura. We are in constant touch with them, we assist them, and we have also helped them supporting their skills when it comes to the negotiating process. In a country where conflict has been going on for so long, empowerment of women, both in politics and in governance, is key for the future. Therefore, women's roles in peace-building initiatives inside Syria is a core issue when it comes to preparing for the post-agreement reconciliation in Syria. We have been very much working to give Syrian women the space and the voice in the peace process. We have supported their inclusion in the negotiations in Geneva. Staffan de Mistura has been very supportive about this. We have helped to create women's networks, such as the Gaziantep Women Platform, and we have supported women empowerment on the ground through the Syria Peace Support Facility. In the same vein, in non-held regime areas, we have supported civilian governments, structures, particularly access to basic services. In northeast Syria, we are engaged in the global coalition stabilization efforts for the post-Daesh areas, particularly Raqqa, and there is Sur, so to improve the present, but also to prepare for the future. This is not only humanitarian aid, this is also particularly demining, which is a key issue, such as in Iraq. And then another point I mentioned before, that's really the need for justice and accountability. We will continue to fund international, impartial and independent mechanism, but also NGOs and international NGOs that work with the international, independent, impartial mechanism. And this is to identify the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity that need to be brought to justice. This is so important in view of transitional justice and reconciliation of the country. Among the most atrocious war crimes are the ones using chemical weapons. This is why we have both strongly condemned the use of chemical weapons by the regime and Daesh, as was documented by the OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism, and we will continue to ask for the identification of the perpetrators of chemical attacks. It was a pity that the Joint Investigation Mechanism was not extended in 2017. By the way, we are also very supporting this in very concrete terms. The SATSEN is providing images to the OPCW in The Hague. Let me conclude by saying that we will remain engaged. Only 2 weeks ago, during the last UN General Assembly, there was a high-level event on Syria which was organized by Federica Mogherini. She was chairing the political part, Commissioner Stylianidis the humanitarian part. It was another effort to demonstrate the international support for the UN-led political process. It brought together more than 50 ministers. It was very important that both the Iranian and the Saudi minister were present because there is this aspect of a proxy war. The UN was there, important civil society organizations, NGOs were there. Federica Mogherini announced that more than 95% of the pledges made in Brussels had been met. She announced that the next conference we will host in March. And my only hope is that by the time we will come to the conference in Brussels in March, that we will have a political process underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Secretary General Schmidt. And I have to say, if we rush in our time plan, you have summit, but Mrs. Schmidt has to leave slightly earlier because she has to fetch a train to Passau, so just to announce it. So, in work purpose, anyway. In work purpose. Same issue, different place. Even also European Parliament, anyway. Good. So now I ask Jean-Louis de Breuer, which he is the Director for Europe, Eastern Neighborhood and Middle East at the Commission's Directorate General for the European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operation, simply DG ECHO. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to this audience for having inviting us to share with you some information about what we do as humanitarian branch of the EU to deal with the dire consequences of the crisis in Syria in the neighboring country. I still would like, this is a conference about CSDP, CFSP, to say a few words about the place EU's humanitarian response to the Syrian crisis is taking in the context of the so-called EU's global strategies for the EU foreign and security policy. The global strategy calls for an integrated approach to external conflicts and crisis as one of its priorities, with the aim of further strengthening the EU's action and addressing all policy dimensions of a conflict. It does this by bringing together multiple means of EU engagement, including diplomatic engagement, development cooperation, and indeed humanitarian assistance. We think as humanitarians that this is for the mutual benefit of all stakeholders involved. On one end, for instance, it certainly contributes to decreasing the humanitarian suffering or to monitor, enforce and report on IHL violation, and I could not agree more with what Helga Schmidt said concerning the crucial, the topicality of the issue of accountability and transitional justice once the conflict will be over. At the same time, and while we engage and coordinate with our political, diplomatic and development colleagues, we always underline that the EU humanitarian policy is guided by the fundamental humanitarian principles as enshrined in the treaty. We are a key part, we see ourselves as humanitarian as a key part of the overall EU response to a crisis like the one in Syria. But we are not, as such, a crisis management tool. We provide, our intervention is guided solely on the basis of the needs of the affected and the vulnerability of the affected population, and is beyond any kind of strategic, political, military, economic or other agenda. I mean, Helga Schmidt said it eloquently in her intervention. I mean, the solution will have to be political, and contrary to what some might think, the humanitarian intervention is by no means the solution of a crisis. On the contrary, we would like to be allowed to leave Syria and the neighboring countries as quickly as possible, because that would mean that in the meanwhile a solution has been found. So I will not repeat the figure that you can find in the background paper, but it's obvious that the EU has been and is still one of the largest donors in humanitarian assistance to the Syria crisis. Together with the development assistance, we have reached some 5.5 billion euro out of the EU budget since the beginning of the crisis. But the EU is also central in leveraging assistance and contributions from other donors, principally through the successive organizations of the so-called Brussels Conference, Brussels I, Brussels II, and very soon it is now confirmed, Brussels III. We remain definitely, and we are proud of it, although it is as a consequence of a crisis that everyone would have have liked to avoid, we remain amongst the top donors to the Syrian crisis, both in Syria and in the neighboring countries. Because indeed, our intervention is by no means limited to the humanitarian consequences of the crisis inside Syria. In terms of figures, I would say that in a year like this one, we are going to commit around 280 million euro out of the humanitarian budget of the Union, 140 dedicated to situation inside Syria, and the remainder 50% dedicated to intervention in Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. I will say a word afterwards about our presence in Turkey, which is also significant. In Syria, we are focusing on providing life-saving assistance, addressing the most urgent needs of the most vulnerable, wherever people are, regardless of whether it is in a regime-controlled areas or not. There, I would like to stress the importance of the concept of the so-called whole of Syria approach. That is to say that we have insisted since the beginning for the need of our partners to have access to people in need, wherever they are and through whatever means. That is the reason why the resolution adopted by the UN Security Council and formally authorizing cross-border delivery of humanitarian aid, mainly from Turkey, Iraq, but also Jordan and Lebanon, was of the essence, is of the essence, and will be renewed again, we expect, from New Year's onwards. This allows our partners to reach millions of people and be provided emergency medical treatment, healthcare, psychosocial support, protection of children and vulnerable people. I will come back in a second on the centrality of the issue of protection, food, safe drinking water, essential items, and shelter. Should we do more? Yes, we should do more. We should adopt our support to, for instance, moving to cash or education support and more sustainable approach. What does more sustainable approach mean? It means, for instance, supporting permanent health facilities instead of mobile clinics. That means also light repairs of water systems instead of water tracking. This has to be also considered in the framework of a phenomenon that is now taking place massively inside Syria, and which is the phenomenon of spontaneous returns of internally displaced persons. These are not refugees, so these are people which have been displaced inside Syria, and according to the latest estimates of HCR, in the last 12 months, around 700,000 Syrians returned to what they call back home, and this, of course, needs a specific type of humanitarian intervention. We are on thin ice there because we must be extremely careful to assess how far we can go. I repeat that our work must be guided and must remain guided by the principles of humanity, neutrality, independence, and impartiality. That means that our humanitarian intervention cannot be seen by any means as supporting one political agenda or another. With regard to the neighboring countries, it is notorious that Lebanon and Jordan have welcomed a large number of refugees from Syria and contributed substantial and generous assistance. Lebanon, for instance, has taken in 1.5 million Syrian and Palestine refugees on the top of those already present from Syria, according to around 30% of the Lebanese population, the highest concentration per capita of refugees in the world. Close to 25% of Jordan population is made up of refugees. Of these, a large number are from Syria, around 650,000 Syrian refugees, 50% of them being children. The vast majority of the refugees in Jordan live in cities and towns, while the remainder resides in the two notoriously famous refugee camps of Zaatari and Ashak. We have supported Jordan and Lebanon since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, mostly through our humanitarian aid partners and focusing on the most vulnerable refugees and their basic needs. and their host basic needs, their host community basic needs. But increasingly, our development partners have come on board, including through compacts agreed between EU and Lebanon and between EU and Jordan. The main objective being to improve the living conditions, not only of the Syrian refugees, but also of the vulnerable host communities to prevent growing tensions between the two. We cannot give up. We cannot give up. Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan are not self-reliant. Refugees in Lebanon could continue to live in substandard shelters, face restrictions in their free movement and access to the basic services. A recent UN report, on the other hand, found that more than 90% of the 90% of the registered Syrian refugees in urban area in Jordan have fallen below the poverty line, with over 70% of the refugees' family deeply indebted, which creates indeed, of course, a very difficult situation for them as well, again, as for the receiving country. A word about Turkey. The number of refugees in Turkey has reached over 3.9 million, making Turkey the country with the highest number of refugees in the world. About 95% of the Syrian refugees in Turkey remain outside of camps with limited but growing access to basic service. While the initial response of the EU was throughout humanitarian assistance, an innovative approach has been adopted. The EU facility for the refugees in Turkey is the answer to the EU member states' call for significant additional funding to support refugees in Turkey. It manages a total of 6 billion euro, 3 billion for the first biennial period 2016-2017, and another 3 billion which is now being implemented for the period 2018-2019. The EU facility for refugees in Turkey is funded from both EU budgets and contributions from the EU member states. The main focus areas are humanitarian assistance, education, migration management, health, municipal infrastructure, and more socio-economic support, meaning social and economic integration of the Syrian refugees into the Turkish social and economic fabric. Let me end up by stressing quickly two matters of concern for us. The crisis in Syria appears more and more as mainly a protection crisis. And that is the reason why constant advocacy is of the essence, besides aid delivery, when dealing with this crisis. I mean, Syria is a country where the protection of civilians and the respect of international humanitarian law are critical and are constantly jeopardized. It is of the essence to repeat endlessly that civilians, including humanitarian workers and civilians infrastructures such as schools and hospitals, cannot be targeted. We need to recall all parties to the conflict up to that end, and we need to speak out loudly when it happens, pending the availability of, again, relevant accountability mechanism. Access is another key concern. Humanitarian actors need to be able to access communities in need, to provide the required assistance, and to provide it in a timely and adequate manner. This is a daily fight. And indeed, as mentioned in the concept note, the Syrian government now controls 2/3 of the territory. But none, I repeat, none of the above challenges has gone away with a change in the conflict dynamic on the ground. I mean, areas under governmental control remains as hard to reach as the previous besieged or so-called hard to reach area. Clearly, we are also in a situation where humanitarian assistance alone is not enough. And that is the reason why we must, as much as possible, as I stated in the beginning, engage with both development and political actors to work together to advocate for key protection and international law concerns. We are now more and more engaged in bringing humanitarian and development assistance to closer in order to better assist the people in need while not crossing the reconstruction red line mind, as stressed by Helga Schmidt in her intervention. But we have to find, as we are obviously confronted with a protracted situation of displacement, to find more sustainable approach to this forced displacement with a view of strengthening the people's self-reliance and dignity. Syrian must not become assistance dependent. That is clearly something which should be a guiding principle for our intervention during the next few years. So it is therefore important also to factor into our agenda the situation of internally displaced persons, I mentioned that earlier, and of host communities. In the same way, we are dealing with and helping refugees according to their vulnerability and to their needs. And of course, we have also to take into account the growing economic challenges countries like Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan are facing today, which makes the effort, the demand addressed to the donors even higher, and that will be certainly one of the key challenges to be dealt with besides the political agenda at the occasions of the Brussels III conference. So coming back and by way of a conclusion to the topic of this conference, EU humanitarian aid is needs-based and based on humanitarian principles, but it can bring the most effective results if and only if it works closely with other EU instruments, bearing in mind long-term solution. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Director De Breuer, for sharing your views with us. And now I will ask Mr. Salam Kawakibi, who is a political scientist and the Executive Director of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Paris. So he will also speak in French. Therefore, welcome.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I will speak to you in French. First of all, I have prepared a number of notes for this conference, mentioning in particular and referring in particular the humanitarian issues. But yesterday, talking to Syrian friends, they reproached me for my naivety, and they said when I should be speaking to you, these representatives of Europe, addressing the humanitarian question, which has been going on for 8 years now, without really provoking any reaction, a tangible reaction. So I will avoid that, and I will try to really raise your interests. Yesterday, we heard statements that shocked me to some extent concerning the migration issue, and I think that on the basis of these migration questions and refugee questions, and this is a major danger for Europeans or for certain Europeans, we must underline the interest of Europe to find a political solution for the situation in Syria. Mrs. Helga Schmidt said that for Europe, the political transition is a compulsory issue and it's inevitable. But the Secretary of State said yesterday that the tone needs to be changed. And he said the only condition to build up Syria again is that Iran leaves Syria. And so this is a condition, a political condition, so this has been dropped. And as Americans have decided something, I'm afraid that this will be imposed, unfortunately. Now, very recently, the Syrian president talked to the ambassadors, and this was cited by the national press in Syria, and he spoke about the situation in Syria, and he said that, and this is more or less a quotation, and it's hard for me to really quote that and repeat that, it is true that we have lost 5 million persons who died in recent years. It is true that more than 7 million Syrians have left the country, but it is also true that we have now a society that is healthy and homogeneous. And I think this will mindful of Europeans of certain things, this question that we had in the 30s, but it was said at that time and there was almost no reaction by the international community. Moreover, in April 2017, a presidential decree stipulated that every person must present himself or herself physically to the municipality of its locality in order to prove identity. Otherwise, the property will be confiscated. That means that 7 million refugees have no longer any properties if they do not present themselves physically to the local authorities. And you must know that the majority will, of course, never be in a situation to present themselves, given this political situation in Syria. And this reminds me of an Israeli law of the 40s, where also it was stipulated that the number of refugees will lose their property and will have to give up their property and whatever they will have. So the demographic changes are taking place, and almost with international support and agreement. I'm not saying this to accuse anybody, but the international silence is quite loud and says many things. No. Everybody speaks about reconstruction. Russia speaks about it and invites Europe to play the same role as it played in Gaza. Pay and don't pay. Pay for the construction and don't ask for any political role in Syria. Fortunately, Europe is refusing that approach for the time being. But things may change very quickly in Europe. On the government level, and given the fact that there is this tendency towards more of an opening of dictatorship and no longer an appreciation of the democratic values, I was often naive and I thought that in France there are basic principal values. But the situation in Syria shows that we only have talks and nothing more, and in the practice is somewhere else. Now, quite recently, on the occasion of the Brussels meeting in April 2017, I had a short meeting, one of the side events, with European officials. And when I mentioned this division inside the European Union concerning politics in Syria, there was some opposition by some of my counterparts in the discussion. And when I gave them some tangible examples of this distinction or division, which is quite striking, because sanctions and the resolutions are not of the United Nations are not applied by all the countries of the European Union, and therefore a number of questions need to be raised. And the most obvious example is the visit of a person responsible for genocide, and he's on the list of the European Union as the most sought-for person in Rome. But that was a private visit organized by the Italian government and with a special flight, and that touched down in Damascus and brought back speakers back to Russia. And the Italian foreign minister at that time, or the vice minister, denied that publicly, but in private he confirmed it. And he told me, well, you are not just up to date. And I said, but if you're not up to date, then you should perhaps step down. And this is how things are happening in Italy. Unfortunately, I have to say these things, but unfortunately, we can also see that economic agreements and in secret between a number of European countries and the Syrian government. And when I say the Syrian government, I mean the private interests of people in the regime and not the public interests of the people of Syria. Two think tanks have made studies among the refugees. The first one was done by Carnegie Middle East in the Lebanon and in Jordan on the conditions for a return to Syria. And at the responses that were given primarily were quite natural. Of course, you want to come back. You want to come back to their own place. And these poor people have been there for 7 or 8 years and have been without any assets and any property under very bad conditions, security conditions, justice conditions, and also political transition. And security, justice, and the political transition. Another study that was made by a German think tank in Berlin concerning refugees in Germany, the reasons why they left Syria. And 9 out of 10 said because of the difficulties, and 1 on 10 said because of the Islamic State. So this danger has been created, and the Islamic State is responsible for, and 30 million Syrians are compared to them. So this is a terrorist regime, a very obscure regime, but on the other hand, there were 5 million persons that were killed by chemical weapons and conventional weapons, and this is also taken with silence and indifference, or almost so, and does not receive any punishment thanks to the Russian pressure on the allies of the European countries. Mrs. Helga Schmidt and the director underlined the attacks against the hospital centers and the health centers and the schools. And the director said one must avoid to do so. But it is being done explicitly, and it's done methodically. This is very important for the survival of the people there. Now, these attacks on the civilian population since 2011 have, first of all, been focused on hospitals, civilian centers, and other health centers. And this is not for military reasons. These are observations by European physicians that have worked there on site with the Syrian population. I can tell you that since 2013, when chemical weapons were used by the regime and had to, still they are not punished for that. This has shown clearly what is the development of the Islamic State, and it shows all these forms and has led to all these forms of extremism and all these thinking that, and has led to a situation where everybody is thinking that this is an open country where everybody can lead a proxy war, and Syria should not be asking for anything such as liberty and independence, because now they only want a country, a civil society, because this is a battle that has been really lost, and the European civilian society has always been engaged and committed to the good cause, and they should reconsider and think that the Arabs and the people in the south deserve democracy, and they are not less than we are, and we must therefore stop supporting dictators, should look for stability, and we should stop the migratory flows, because it was, as it was said yesterday, if you want to stop these migratory flows, you have to find and look for the sources, for the origins of it, And by way of conclusion, I will express this sign of despair by people who are no longer getting a visa, people who paid 11,000 euros trying to come to smugglers in order to be able to come here and to eventually lead up in France. And this is the situation that you should bear in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kawakibi, for this maybe also tough and a discussion-provoking speech. And also thank you for your intervention. And now the floor is open. The system is the same like yesterday, so we already have a list. Here also, I will ask Eugen Freund, first speaker.
Thank you very much. And good morning, and as being a Viennese, I would also like to say welcome to Vienna. But the big question, of course, is why did we get here where we are? And I think one of the reasons is because the European Union does not have a coherent, self-assured, strong, common foreign policy. If we had one, in 2011, we could have been in Syria as a strong European force, diplomatic force, behind us 500 million people, a strong, one of the strongest economies, and we could have mediated at a time when there were demonstrations in the streets, but there were not hundreds of thousands of deaths. There was no Turkey, there was no Iran, there was no Russia, there was no IS involved in this conflict. But we did not do it. And then we saw the millions of people who fled the country, and in 2015 they knocked at our doors, and now we are even closing these doors. Why am I telling you this? The reason is because Syria is not alone. Syria is not the only country which does suffer and where other countries may see the same fate. I will not name a country in Northern Africa, but we have a leader there who is, I don't know, 115 years old, and his trembling hand is holding down the cover of the pressure cooker in order for that not to explode. But one of these days, it will explode. And then what will we do? 7 years later, we will come together and we will lament the situation there, and we will try to collect some money for these poor people, and we will throw up our hands and we will say, sorry, we were not early enough on the ground in order to mediate or in order to do something. So that's why I'm pleading to all those here who have some influence on the European Union, like a member of the European Parliament, but also the national parliaments. Get your act together and come up with a common, strong, self-assured foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugen. The next speaker is Piero Fassino. Piero, please. From Italy.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you. First of all, I thank the speakers because we see that the European Union is making huge efforts over the years. And the EU has been acting in the Syrian crisis without aiming at hegemony, because Iran, Turkey, and Russia want to have their hegemony over the area. But I believe that Syria raises a question that Mr. Freud said. The weakness of supranational institutions. For 8 years, every night we watch footing of the Syrian disaster. But Why are we waiting? Why are we not stopping this catastrophe? There's no answer, because who can take action to stop it? Some say the UN. Okay, the UN may take action with the consensus of its members. The Security Council does not agree on how to take action, so I believe that the Syrian question raises another issue, which is that of sovereignty. What type of sovereignty and powers supranational institutions have? A global world cannot be ruled by sovereign states. Sovereign states confer their powers to supranational institutions to take action. Otherwise, these catastrophes will continue. We engage in a huge humanitarian effort to reduce the suffering, but here the issue is that we have to transfer national sovereignty to supranational institution. There's the rub.
Mrs. Schmidt has to leave in...
No, I still have 20 minutes. I still have 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Then we're continuing the list. The next is from Hungary, Solt Nemet.
Thank you, Andreas.
Please always put up your hand that the camera can find. Perfect.
Good morning, dear colleagues, to all of you. Thank you for all three contributions. I would like to express first my deep empathy with the victims. When we talk about such a subject, I think we need to start out from the hundreds of thousands of victims who have been the victims of the conflict we are just talking about. Secondly, I would like to make a reference to the discussion yesterday on migration. Mr. Zaoralek was underlining yesterday the importance that migration and foreign policy has. Here we are, and I would like to underline the principle what the Hungarian government in the past years has found the most important one, that we need not to import the problem into Europe, but we have to, it is our obligation to do our utmost to help to solve the root causes of the problem. And there we are. Syria is the number one, far the number one root cause of the problem. I believe that the humanitarian support, what has been introduced to us, is vital, and we all know that the United Nations plays a very important role in that. We have to keep it in mind. I would like also to draw your attention that there are some maneuvering potential for the nation states as well. We Hungarians, we have introduced the Hungary Helps program, and it is not a big size, but probably the modalities is interesting for you as well. We have 700 scholarships for Syrians at the moment happening in Hungary, and we want to increase the number of scholarships they can study in Hungary. And also, I would like to draw your attention to the importance of the churches, especially the Christian churches. We shouldn't be shy about that, to help our Christian fellows in Syria. There are the Orthodox Syriacs, there are the Melkite Greco-Catholics. We have signed agreements with these churches. And probably, I don't know if it is humanitarian or reconstruction, and I don't really care, but we have been able to rebuild schools, kindergartens, refugee centers with the help of the churches. And finally, I would like to ask two questions from you, dear colleagues, especially Mrs. Helga Schmidt. Idlib is really one of the most imminent and serious dimensions of the Syrian conflict. With these very days, we have deadlines. Yesterday, we had the deadline that the hard tanks and the rest should leave the Idlib region. And on the 15th of October, we have another deadline that the so-called extremist groups have to be removed from the Idlib region. How is that? Can you give us some information that how is it happening? The agreement has been made a month ago. And the other question is the most important, is the relationship between the political process and reconstruction. That is the real question. What is
Thank you.
I would like to ask the
extremely over your time already.
Thank you. But the question is now coming. So I would like what is the relationship between the political process and the reconstruction? And is there anything happening concerning the reconstruction? Thank you very much.
The next one is from Slovenia, Sama Khalil.
Thank you very much. I will be much shorter to save some time. Dear colleagues, when we talk about the improvement of the political and humanitarian situation in Syria, we often do not talk about the root causes for this situation, but we concentrate on the resolving of the consequences. I strongly believe that this way of addressing humanitarian crisis enables the setting up of a common humanitarian system which could be used in other future humanitarian crises in the region. I think that we should do more in the field of identifying the key reasons for the Syrian crisis in order to build up, and this is important, a sustainable approach for the preventing future crises. This is the only way we will not have the same conversation, not if, but when the next crisis will arrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next one is from the European Parliament, Sabine Lösing.
Just 1 second. I will be speaking German. Well, so the presentation, I think from our representative, the Syrian operation, well, it seems very clear. But all the same, I'd like to point out that the politics, that policies which strengthen, which lead to a strengthening of radical forces, and that we should just accept that, well, that's a dreadful policy. And I think that we shouldn't be repeating that mistake in the future. And I think that that's enough of a reason, as Europeans, as representatives of the European Parliament, well, we have a responsibility. So whichever analysis we use for the future, the question is, what does it bring? What's the benefit of having peace? And what will bring peace and what will improve the humanitarian situation? And then with Russia, well, I think we have to involve Russia in a process of reconciliation. I think it is, despite everything, it's a transitional process. If that leads to a new government, well, it could be part of the discussions, but it shouldn't be a precondition. So the humanitarian situation, it requires that the restrictions and the oil embargo should be lifted. And under some circumstances, it might be possible to lift restrictions on assets when these are being used for humanitarian measures or for reconstruction. So to finish, so a call for reconstruction in Syria, and it doesn't help if we use money for humanitarian grounds, or if we have funds available for reconstruction. It doesn't help if those funds are then not actually used. It doesn't help anybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Joël Curiot from France.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 12 million persons have been displaced, and 5 million are dead, were just said by Mr. Kavabiki, and I would like to thank him for his statement here. You spoke very emotionally, and this is quite a large number, and for us, and quite a burden for us, European working. So and this has now been, Syria has become a country where other forces are fighting a proxy war, and the population in Lebanon has and they all depend on what is happening and what is being acted by Russia and what is happening to Bashar al-Assad. And there has to be a military de-escalation. You have to stop the perspective, and you have to look for a political solution. And a marginalization of Europe is a fatality, and most likely stronger than in the situation of Cuba. And I think Europe is being divided, as you just said yourself, and diplomatic negotiations are necessary in order to work together and to find here a harmonization, a proximization of the positions, and in order to find a solution eventually. But this is a long way, and we have to speak about this in great detail, and we also have to try to find an end for this political problem. And we need to have some elections. There need to be a transition, and it's in the interest of everybody that long-lasting stabilization is necessary, and the other forces have to leave the place. And Europe, since we have, and Europe has succeeded in coming closer to peace, and they have to help other countries, such as Syria, to set that up as well.
Dankeschön. The next one is from the Czech Republic, Lubomir Zaoralek.
Zaoralek, yeah. Yeah. Dear colleagues, allow me to stress on the beginning that we are really facing very complicated and difficult situation, because our position is in total contradiction. On one side, we have to note that from the side of EU, series of restrictive measures against the Syrian regime after the Syrian government are creating situation when we suspended all cooperation programs between the EU and Syria on one side. On the other side, it's reality. The current Syrian government controlled around 2/3 of country's territory and almost all major population center. It's reality. That is very complicated and difficult to deliver humanitarian aid to all parts, maybe the parts which are most needed. We are using United Nations organization. We're very complicated to find a way how directly to help some segments of territory. I know that some countries now, our members, are using Russia as a partner to deliver the aid. It's reality. And the problem is that, maybe it was said, one of the predecessors in this discussion, that I agree that the situation is the result of policy, the lack of coherent foreign policy in Syria for a long time. And now we are speaking, we have some clear position, we are stressing that we are ready to support transition, we are ready to support reconstruction of the country, but under the precondition of political transformation. I would like to stress that it will be very useful to have precise definition, what does it mean, this political transformation, and I can tell you that we can wait more than 10 years. I feel sorry, but it's reality. The situation could be more than 10 years, and we are losing step by step, EU is losing ground, because the process of some reconstruction is starting and happening right now in Syria. Money are from China and many other parts, and Europe is losing ground in Iraq, in Iran. Europe is losing ground also in Syria. And I'm afraid that we have no strategy how to change the situation. And because, as I said yesterday, this division between the countries in the EU, it is the reason why we are in this blind alley.
Thank you. Next speaker is from the European Parliament, Bas Belder. And please always, exactly, perfect.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chair. If you'd allow me, as a Dutchman, to speak German. Thank you. So I've got 3 remarks to make. First of all, we had a debate in the National Parliament about which groups are we actually supporting in Syria, because we want to improve the humanitarian situation and the political situation. And so if we don't support the right ones, that it's also happened sometimes, yeah? If you support the wrong groups. In America, with America it's happened. And I think, if I've heard correctly, I didn't hear anything about the Kurdish question and in Idlib. So I think we have a dilemma here. The status quo means we're supporting Al-Qaeda, or Al-Nusra is there. And a military solution creates a humanitarian crisis. So it really is the frying way between the devil and the deep blue sea. And that was my remark, and I hope that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now like to hand over to our Secretary General, Mrs. SCHMID.
Indeed, I have to apologize that I will have to leave in 5 minutes, but actually I had taken a speaking engagement at the Congress under the umbrellaship of the European Parliament half a year ago, but I also wanted to come here, so this is the reason why. Let me respond to some of the questions that were addressed to me, and many referred to the issue political process, reconstruction. Do we will have to wait for 10 years? The situation is the following, and I think this is also replies to what Mr. Kawakiwi said. We don't have to wait for 10 years, this is for sure, but we have to be very clear that we cannot finance a recovery that was fomented by others, and not in respect of some of the key issues. Because what does it mean if we just put money in the hands of the regime? It means that we will have zero leverage when it comes, for example, to law number 10. Law number 10, which would lead to demographic engineering. This is an issue we raise constantly, also with countries such as Iran that have an influence on the Syrian regime. This is totally unacceptable because it would not create a sustainable situation. We would just create another crisis. So we have to, this is why Resolution 2020-54 is so important, because it defines what the future Syria should look like. It has to be inclusive. The question that was raised on the Christian issue, the Kurds, is absolutely relevant. We want to have a Syria which is not based on dividing lines, on ethnic lines or religious lines. And we have leverage there because Iran does not have the money to fund the reconstruction. Russia does not have the money either. And I have not heard so much about Chinese reconstruction there. They're also very, very cautiously following what's happening there. This does not mean that we are not active at all. And this ties to the question about the political process. This is why the Constitutional Committee is so important, because once the Constitutional Committee gets off the ground, that is there actually to define the future governance, to see, is it about working out a new constitution? What will the future Syria look like? This will allow to engage in the political process. It's also not true that we're not doing anything other than humanitarian. We have done a lot in terms of addressing the issues of education, livelihoods, health, but also basic services, repairing of schools, basic infrastructure, where it was possible, particularly in some of the de-escalation zones, opposition-held areas, and very much so also in the neighboring country. I agree very much with the need to address the root causes. This is absolutely crucial. On Idlib, I do not have the latest on the ground, but what is also very clear is, and this relates to the last question, is we have the problem here that yes, there is a presence of terrorist groups, Al-Nusra and others. What we were discussing, and this is why the engagement of Turkey, but also others, was very much important, to make sure that this is done in a way that it does not cause a major bloodshed. This is absolutely crucial, because you have 3 million civilians there. And they cannot become victims in a fight against terrorism, which is an important one. And by the way, eradication of terrorism is not done through military means. Eradication of terrorism is done by providing a political perspective. It was very interesting of what you were saying. I have heard the same opinion posed. People will only go back once they can be clear that there will not be any barrel bombs used more by the regime, and once there is a basic idea about their security and protection. Then there is the issue of the assured EU, self-assured EU foreign policy. I mean, we need to see what this means. I mean, this is, as I said in the beginning, the situation is very, very complicated because actually it's a proxy war, and because many, unfortunately, in the region have actually used this to increase their own positions. Does it mean that the European Union is in and this is a question for member states, would be ready to intervene militarily, question mark. I mean, we are always ready to act, and I can only welcome any suggestions to mandate us. And I think we have shown, for example, in the cases of the negotiations with Iran, where we had a clear mandate from the Security Council, we were supported by all 28 member states, and we had a successful outcome, which averted another military conflict, most likely, but definitely a nuclear arms race in the region. So any suggestions are very much welcome, but we also have to realize that this is a very, very complicated situation with many powerful regional powers also trying to increase their respective positions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us also due to your time pressure, which is on the issue. Thank you for your thoughts, and we wish you a good journey to Passau. Thank you for coming. Maybe we can give a small applause also. Danke schön. Danke. Wiederschauen. And now we jump back to the speakers list. The next one is Tobias Pflüger from Germany. Please always move up your hand.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. It's a shame that Helga Schmidt has to leave now because I have a question which probably I will have to send her in writing. So, in the context of Syria, I wanted to concentrate on one of the stakeholders, and that is Turkey. You have described that the EU has supported Turkey with 6 billion euros during this crisis. And as I understood you, then you said that 3.9 million refugees are in Turkey at the moment, and 95% of those are not in camps. So our information says that it's the Kurdish communities who on the ground who are helping refugees. It's not usually government structures from Turkey. So this cooperation with Turkey, I see it as being very problematic. Turkey has marched into Syria against international law and has set up they've taken Turkish flags into the schools and they've taught lessons there. That's an open provocation and violation of international law. And the Turkish side is working with all kinds of groups, including those that are very closely connected with IS. So obviously we have to, I don't want to say any more about the Turkish government and the situation in Turkey with the how they're dealing with the opposition and with journalists. I don't want to go into that. We are very careful about how we handle the Turkish government, partly because of this deal, even though it seems that all that the Turkish government is really doing is holding refugees back. So my question is, have you any indication about where this money is flowing, this money that we are giving to Turkey? And is this money really being used as it should, as is laid down in the rules? There's for refugee purposes, because it seemed to be indications that it's being used for other purposes by the Turkish government. And then one more point, and that is it's counterproductive, I think, to get involved in cooperate with Turkey on this conflict. at the present time. Simone.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would like you all ask a question. Are we, the European Union, are we going to finance the reconstruction in Syria with the Bashar Assad regime? It's a question, I think, to which we should all reply. And then you will all remember that the regime at the beginning of the Syrian revolution, where 10,000 terrorists freed, and the fight is really between the regime and the terrorists. I don't think there should be any confusion, and especially not in the public mind here. And secondly, you will all remember that there was this chemical bombing, and at the very last moment, no measures were taken against it at the very last moment. So I think these bombings were on hospitals, were on schools, and this created panic among the population, and caused also thousands of deaths. Now, we as a European Union have shown here that we were not in a position to do anything, and I think we should exert some pressure on all these regimes. That is, we are not yet ready to finance the reconstruction in Syria unless but there's the regime of Azerbaijan.
Next speaker is from Bulgaria, Georgi Mihailov.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. The question was addressed by Madam Schmidt. My question would be to Madam Schmidt. Unfortunately, she has left the room. I was very much impressed by the presentation of Mr. Kalibi, and where he reminded us that there are very strong divisions, political divisions, among the countries of the European Union in connection with Syria. And my question is, if in Syria, if here the European Union is not homogeneous in its approach, how can it then happen that in all other issues of security policy we can obtain some disposition, because the same situation arises in connection with Europe as such, because we know that there are problems on the territories that are divided in various parts of Europe, and these are issues that are quite obvious. And the general question for us is if this is possible, if it is possible to have a homogeneous policy of the European Union, and if we cannot do that, then we need it.
Thank you. Next speaker is Christian Tybring-Gjedde from Norway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a backbencher here from Norway. Norway is it's one of the largest humanitarian contributors to alleviating the Syrian crisis. In total, the contribution from 2016 to 2019 will be more than 1 billion euros. Most of this money is directed at immediate measures to save lives, relieve distress, and ensure the best possible protection for the civilian population. But we also have a particular focus on education for children and adolescents. My comments is to Mr. Salam Kawakibi. I didn't hear any solutions for the future or how to approach the conflict in Syria. I heard all complaints about what we should not do and what we do wrong everywhere. And it's not very helpful, I think, in a discussion like this to not come up with an alternative to what we do. If you want to do something different, then that's fine. And I think that's what political scientists would like to do, encourage us to do something different if we do something wrong. It's easy to criticize, but it's very difficult to come up with alternative solutions. So just an encouragement for me, and I hope that also future debates that instead of saying everything we do wrong, and I know sure it's a lot of things we do wrong, please try to come up with alternative solutions, and maybe that's something we can actually do. Thank you.
Tusen takk. And the last speaker from the audience is Ana Gomes from the European Parliament.
Yes, I would like to start to, as we started with my colleague Eugen Freund denouncing indeed the hypocrisy, the cowardice, the lack of notion of our strategic interests that has totally made us be inactive in Syria. And I can't stand it anymore that we hide under this humanitarian assistance and indeed nothing is really serving our interests, and not to mention the interests of the people on the ground. We have only enabled Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, Israel to indeed be creating trouble in the region for the people of the region, making countries like Iraq, like Lebanon, like Syria, like Jordan pay the brunt of it. And indeed our major interests, including our security, real security interests, namely against terrorism, are indeed not served by our policy. So I just would like, I totally second what Simon Zuskind has said, that we cannot go into reconstruction, paying the reconstruction of Syria when with Assad, a criminal like Assad still there. We have to indeed get exposed the hypocrisy that Mr. Kawakibi said about Italy receiving Ali Mamluk, even giving him a plane, in total contradiction with our policies. Hungary giving a golden visa to Atia Kori for money laundering for the Syrian regime. This is simply not acceptable anymore. And I plead with the people in the External Action Service, Helga SCHMID, Mogherini in their last year in office, please confront our member states with their responsibilities and let's act European at least once, indeed to serve our own interests in the interests of our people as well as the people of Syria.
Thank you, Anna. And now I will ask you both to take about 5 minutes to give an answer to the huge topic and a lot of questions.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Yes. Let me begin with the last question that was addressed to me by the representative of Norway. And I would like to confirm that Norway has played a major humanitarian role of Syria. But at the same time, he kind of reproached me that I, as a researcher and scientist, cannot and did not propose any solutions. Now, what I have raised here by way of criticism already includes the solution. When I speak of dictatorship, the solution is democracy. When I speak about crimes against humanity, then the answer is justice. And when I speak about demographic changes, then the solution is actual and realistic sanctions. Now, you have all been elected, and you're all politicians, well known, and you have the experience. I will not give you any lessons that I give to my students, but you are right. The 7 minutes or the 10 minutes that you have in a presentation like this do not make it possible to go into further details and to describe any solutions. As far as the representative from Germany and from the European Parliament is concerned, I think from Germany, I think you spoke about the Islamic radicalist, and Mrs. Schmidt replied to that, and the Islamists were not part of the peaceful demonstrations on the 15th of March 2011. The Islamists were, I'm talking about the radical Islamists, I'm not talking about the moderate ones, and the radical Islamists were manipulated by the Syrian regime in the years 2010 and to make the jihad and against American occupation, and then they were taken prisoners, and then we have documents, and I invite you to read that, and this is not written by any militant persons, but this was written by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. It's very important. It's also very important to tell you that in 2 months, the Syrian government has provided death certificates to 8,000 families, announcing the death of their family members in prisons. And 8,000 certificates of these deaths were sent to the families, and these were sent and transmitted officially. And they said that the cause was cardiac failure. And here, I would like to mention Councillor Ken and his extraordinary work on these files on torture organized by the Syrian regime. The gentleman from Germany, you said that the Kurds are helping the refugees more than the state. I'm not in agreement with you, with your permission, and let me tell you also that apart from being, I don't want to become involved in Turkish politics, but Turkey has offered to Syrians the welcome and also the assistance and also education on a gratuitous basis and to all of these Syrian refugees in Turkey. We cannot hide this truth. So Turkey has, of course, benefited for other purposes. And if you have any complaints here, I respect it, but please do not mix up the situation of the Syrian refugees in the other political issues of the Erdogan government. But the Kurdish population, and unfortunately, they are military dominated by a strength that is not very demographic, but it's rather a Stalinistic party, the PKK. And they are negotiating with the Syrian government in order to open their territory to them. So it's not really the Kurds that help the refugees as a population, as all the population in the area, but the Kurds as a political formation, such as the PKK, do not do so. The people as such will help the refugees. And you spoke about the intervention in the north of Syria. Perhaps this is all right, but you should also know that this is against international law. And let me tell you that Syria is an open space, and everybody is there: American forces, Iranian forces, Lebanese forces, Iraqi forces, Pakistani forces, and everybody's in Syria. And recently, we've also had troops from Russia with their mercenaries from private society in order to do the assassinations. So let me end by saying that the sanctions, in order to come back to the statement by the Czech representative, believe me, sir, that China, when they invest, they think of their money. They will not invest in a system where there is corruption has existed for many decades. They always think of the profit they can make of their money, and they will not invest a single cent in Syria to support the regime, but they will not run the risk of investing there in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief because we are getting near to the end of this session. First, let me repeat what I tried to say in my first intervention. There is not, on the one hand, the political agenda of the EU represented here by Helga SCHMID, and on the other hand, the humanitarian agenda, which I would have presented to you. We are part of an integrated approach, of a global approach from the EU side of the situation in Syria. I take the point of that Madame Gomez made eloquently. You can find that the different strands of this approach are not balanced enough, but we are deeply convinced by, that the fact that, for instance, humanitarian advocacy going beyond simply humanitarian aid delivery can also contribute to set the scene for a more impactful EU approach. There were several questions asked, for instance, about what's going to happen in Idlib. The latest news coming from the Turkish side are indeed that it seems that the first deadline concerning the implementation of the Idlib operation is being met. We have been constantly insisting, including by direct interaction with both the Turkish and the Russian interlocutor, on the fact that they should now associate the UN agencies as quickly as possible to the design of the implementation of this initiative, so that humanitarian imperative could be duly taken into consideration. How are you going to bring aid inside beyond the so-called buffer zone? What are you going to handle the population movement through the buffer zone and inside the Idlib governorate? All that are absolutely essential questions that have to be dealt with if indeed one wants to avoid the bloodbath that could have been foreseen in Idlib. Just an example. Now, on the very specific 2 points, I indeed pay tribute to the tremendous effort that Norway, as other donors, has been making. By the way, Norway was one of the co-chair of the first Brussels I conference, and I would like to stress the importance of what the Norwegian colleagues, as others said, about investing in education, not only in Syria but also in the region. Education in speaking too quickly. No, move your earphones. Okay. Sorry for that. Education in general, and education in emergency. We are losing an entire generation there of children who have not seen a school for 2, 3, 4 years. And of course, this is breeding ground for all kind of possible dysfunctional behavior, including moving towards radicalization. Now, on the question concerning Turkey, I will not elaborate on why we are there or not. I just simply state that we are implementing a statement which was adopted by the 28 EU member states at the highest level, that the facility for refugees in Turkey is financed on the basis of the first set 2/3, 1/3, the second set 1/3, 2/3 by the member states' contribution, that the member states, the 28 member states, are closely involved in the management of this facility and in the way we are spending EU money through that facility. We have total control and total transparency on the way the money is spent. If I refer to, for instance, what we've been doing during the first phase of the facility, the 3 billion euro, 1.4 was used for humanitarian purposes, 1.6 for, I would say, more structural development purposes. The bulk of the money of the humanitarian leg of the facility was spent on one end to a grant to WFP, and on the other end with a grant to UNICEF, in view of supporting on one end multi-purpose cash transfer to the benefit of the Syrian refugees, and on the other end facilitating access to the schooling system for refugee children in particularly vulnerable situation. The rest of the money was spent in local infrastructure to the competent Turkish ministry, was spent in setting up an education framework, amongst other things, by paying for the salaries of the teachers involved in this dedicated program offered to Syrian refugee children, and was spent on the development of health infrastructure. So there is absolute and total transparency about the way this money is spent, and there is absolutely no aid diversion with regard to the way this facility is being implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you.